Thank you. It's great to be back. Our species has what you might call a history of violence, and I'm here to speak to you about it today, starting logically enough with the past. And can I have my slides on the confidence monitor, please? Thank you. The most obvious fact about violence in the past is that there was a lot more of it. For example, homicide. It turns out that in many parts of Europe, homicide statistics go back 800 years. And if you plot them on a semi-log axis, you see an obvious trend. Namely, there's been a massive decline in the homicide rate from 1200 to 2000. This occurred not just in England, but in every European region for which data exist. Here you have Italy, the Netherlands, Germany, and Switzerland, and Scandinavia. Here is the average of those, and what you can see from these overlapping curves is that there's approximately a 35-fold decline in the rate of homicide in Europe over 800 years. Also, a noticeable contrast between the present and the past is the form of criminal punishment. Typical forms of criminal punishment in medieval and early modern Europe included breaking on the wheel, burning at the stake, clawing with iron hooks, sawing in half from the crotch down, and impalement. But in a period of just 50 years, the second half of the 18th century, there was a wave of abolitions of the use of judicial torture as a form of routine criminal punishment, including our own prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment in the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution, which took place right in the middle of this wave. Also abolished during this period, the European Enlightenment, was the profligate use of the death penalty for non-lethal crimes. In 18th century England, there were 222 capital offenses on the law books, including poaching, counterfeiting, robbing a rabbit warren, being in the company of gypsies, and, quote, strong evidence of malice in a child 7 to 14 years of age. By 1861, the number of capital crimes had been reduced to 4. Now, the death penalty itself has been abolished in most of the democratic world. Here you have a timeline for the abolition of capital punishment in Europe. Most of the abolitions were in the 20th century, but the blue timeline, which shows the number of European countries that actually carry out executions, shows that before politicians got around to striking capital punishment from the law books, their countrymen had pretty much lost their taste for putting people to death. Now, the United States is an outlier among Western democracies in still having the death penalty, but even in the United States, capital punishment is a shadow of its former self, as you see from this graph, which plots the rate of execution from colonial times to the early 21st century. Other abolitions during the Enlightenment include witch hunts, religious persecution, like burning heretics at the stake, dueling among men of honor, blood sports like bear baiting, debtors' prisons, and most famously of all, slavery. Slavery used to be legal everywhere on earth. No one seemed to think there was anything wrong with it. The Bible had no problem with slavery. So-called democratic Athens had about a third of its population as slaves. But then, beginning in the 18th century, there was a trickle of abolitions that grew into a wave that eventually encompassed the entire world, culminating in 1980 when Mauritania became the last country to abolish slavery. So we've been living through a unique 35-year period of human history in which slavery has not been legal anywhere on earth. The world has seen not one, but 2 declines of war, hard as it may be to believe. Here we have a graph showing the rate of death in war in the 20th century and spilling over to the 21st. There's no mistaking the 2 horrific spikes of bloodletting centered around World War I and World War II, but many of us grew up with the assurance that World War III was only a matter of time, and because of nuclear weapons, the ultimate clash between the US and the Soviet Union would be even worse than the first 2 world wars. But as you can see from the graph, World War III did not happen. We've been living through a period that historians sometimes call the long peace. The fact that since 1946, there's been a historically unusual decline in interstate war. That's war with a government on each side. In fact, the most interesting statistic from this period is 0. Since 1946, there were, of course, no direct wars between the United States and the Soviet Union. No nuclear weapon has been used since Nagasaki. There have been no wars between any two great powers since the end of the Korean War in 1953. No wars between any two Western European countries, which might almost seem today to be an obvious, boring fact, like who would ever expect, say, France and Germany to fight a war? But needless to say, through much of European history, this was not the case. In fact, before 1945, Western European countries alone started 2 new wars a year for 600 years. As of 1945, that went to 0. And there have been no wars between developed countries. We tend to think today that war is something that takes place in the poorer, more backward parts of the world. But for most of human history, it was actually the big, rich countries that were constantly at each other's throats. And because big, rich countries can afford big, destructive armies, those wars did a lot of damage. A more tentative development is one that I call the new peace, referring to the fact that since the end of the Cold War around 1990, there have been fewer wars of all kinds, fewer civil wars, fewer wars between poor countries, and lower rates of death from all flavors of war. Here we have the rate of death in war from 1946 to 2008, and I've stacked them in layers corresponding to the 4 major kinds of war. Here we have the rate of death from colonial wars, which petered out to 0 as European empires gave up their overseas colonies. Here you have the rate of death from interstate wars, that's country against country, with spikes for Korea, Vietnam, and Iran, Iraq. Here you have the rate of death from purely internal civil wars and civil wars with external intervention. So the world has gone through something of a roller coaster since World War II, but the overall trend is unmistakably downward, and here you have a kind of thin laminate of layers corresponding to the early 21st century. There have also been declines in violence against women and children. Here you have a plot of the rate of rape in the United States since data were first recorded in the 1970s, down 80%. There's been a similar decline in the rate of domestic violence since the early 1990s. A decline of the use of corporal punishment in schools. Paddling and strapping children is on its way out. A decline in spanking in every Western country. Parents are losing their taste for beating their children. And a steep decline in the percentage of motion pictures in which animals were harmed. So all this raises a question: why has violence declined on so many scales of time and magnitude? In my book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, I suggest that human nature has not changed, but rather that human nature has always included several motives that incline us toward violence, such as exploitation, dominance, revenge, and ideologies that justify violence, but it also comprises a number of motives that inhibit us from violence, what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, such as empathy, self-control, norms and taboos, and reason. And what has changed over the course of history is that our institutions and norms increasingly bring out our better angels. What do I have in mind by that? Well, democratic government, for example, which prevents people from preying on each other without preying on the people itself. Commerce, which makes it cheaper to buy things than to steal things, and makes other people more valuable alive than dead. You don't kill your customers. The growth of media, perhaps appropriate here at the Media Lab, the widespread availability of journalism and movies and fiction allow people to project themselves into the lives of people who are unlike themselves and thereby expand our circle of empathy. And the expansion of education and expertise, which increasingly allows us to treat violence as a problem to be solved rather than as a contest to be won. Okay, let me switch now from violence in the past to violence in the present. A lot has gone on in the world in the 5 years since I sent The Better Angels of Our Nature off to press. We have seen the rise of ISIS. We've seen civil war in Ukraine. We've seen unrest in the streets of the United States following Ferguson. We've seen a number of school shootings. And of course, we have seen Cecil the Lion. And this raises the question, has the decline of violence reversed since The Better Angels was written in 2010? Well, there's one way not to answer that question, and that is to read the news. Because the news is a systematically misleading way to understand the world. We know this from research in cognitive psychology on how we intuitively assess risk. The late psychologist Amos Tversky and his collaborator, the Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman, have proposed that we assess risk by a rule of thumb that they call the availability heuristic. Namely, the easier it is to imagine or remember an example, the more likely that kind of event is estimated to be. And that's why we systematically misperceive a number of risks. We're more afraid of dying in plane crashes, shark attacks, and nuclear accidents than we are in car crashes, falling down the stairs, or using a portable generator indoors. Even though the latter three are far more likely to kill us, they just don't make the headlines. So what happens when the availability heuristic is fed by the news? Well, remember that news is about stuff that happens. It's not about stuff that doesn't happen. Journalists cover plane crashes. They don't cover planes that take off. And many journalistic outlets follow the programming guideline, if it bleeds, it leads. Well, if you combine the availability heuristic with the nature of news, you get the impression that the world is more dangerous than it ever has been, and as the news becomes more efficient at reporting events, that perception can only increase. Well, the cure for the cognitive and journalistic biases is obviously data. How many bad things happen as a proportion of the number of opportunities, and has that proportion changed over time? So like The Godfather, I'd like to get my bad news right away, so I will start off with the bad news. Here is a plot of the number of wars from 1946 to the most recent year for which data are available. It's basically an extension of the graph that I showed you earlier. And there has definitely been a trend in the wrong direction since 2010, although here is, whoops. But putting it into perspective, the recent uptick has only brought us back to the level that we are in 2000. So it's wiped out about a dozen years of progress. If you plot the rate of battle death, this lavender line shows the date at which Better Angels went to press. You see, again, there has been an uptick in the rate of death from civil war from its low point of the early years of the decade. Although, once again, it has wiped out about a dozen years of progress. Neither the number of wars nor the rate of death in war are anywhere close to what they were in the 50s, the 70s, or the 80s. Why have civil wars increased in the past 3 years? Well, to put it crudely, it is because of jihad and Putin. Of the 11 ongoing civil wars, 8 of them involve radical jihadist forces on one side, and another 2 of them are wars in Ukraine. So that's 10 out of the 11 that can be attributed to these 2 sources. Now for the good news, which is that that's the only bad news. On the same axes, I've plotted the number of interstate wars, and as you can see, that has stuck to the floor of 0 ever since the Iraq War in 2003. So interstate war is not making a comeback. Despite setbacks in Venezuela, Russia, and China, and elsewhere, the overall trajectory of democracy continues to be upwards, and the global democracy score is at its all-time high. The rate of homicide continues to drop, both in the United States and gradually in the world as a whole. A number of criminologists are suggesting that it could be possible to reduce the global rate of homicide by 50% in the next 30 years. The death penalty is on death row, and since the book went to press, 3 more states have abolished the death penalty, and it's widely predicted that the American death penalty will go the way of the death penalty in other Western democracies. Capital punishment worldwide is in decline. Here we have a graph from Amnesty International of the number of abolitionist countries, and if current trends continue, capital punishment will be gone from the world by 2026. Violence against women continues its decline since Better Angels went to press, as has violence against children. And finally, what about Cecil the Lion? Well, Cecil the Lion notwithstanding, hunting continues its decline. It's not just that people are spending more time indoors and looking at screens. The rate of bird watching and other kinds of wildlife watching has increased while violence has decreased. So people still like to be in the presence of animals, just increasingly they like to look at them rather than kill them. So to sum up recent trends in violence, radical Islamists and Putin have erased 14 of the last 24 years of progress in the decline of civil war, but all other declines of violence have persisted or continued. These include interstate war, democracy, homicide, capital punishment, violence against women, violence against children, and violence against animals. Well, what about the future of violence? It's been said that social scientists should never try to predict the future. We have enough trouble predicting the past. And speaking of angels, it is said that fools rush in where angels fear to tread. That hasn't stopped me in the past, and so I will share some thoughts on the future of violence. Now, some forms of violence, once abolished, more or less stay abolished. We're unlikely to see a return of human sacrifice anytime soon, throwing a virgin into a volcano to placate angry gods. That's pretty much gone from the planet for good. Cannibalism is unlikely to see to come back into style anytime soon. I don't think we'll see the return of eunuchs, chattel slavery, or debtors' prisons, and public torture executions. There are other categories of violence which could go the same way. Hard as it is to believe, it is not impossible that interstate war could go the way of throwing virgins into volcanoes. There are only 190 or so players, and if all of them become convinced that war is a futile way of solving disputes, we could see the end of it. That's certainly the way the world has been going. Forms of violent punishment, likewise, like capital punishment and corporal punishment, could disappear from the world forever. And punishment of victimless acts like homosexuality, drug possession, possibly even prostitution. There are other forms of violence which certainly will not disappear, but they could decrease further. This includes homicide and other violent crimes within effective functioning states. Now that we know that it is possible to bring rates of homicide and rape and domestic violence down, there's no reason that the best practices in reducing them couldn't spread to other cities and countries. Violence against women globally is a cause that all countries have signed on to, including domestic violence and rape. Violence against children globally, such as child abuse and bullying, together with child labor and child trafficking. There may, however, be some categories of violence which may not decrease anytime soon. I don't think we're going to see much of a reduction in civil war over the next 5 years or so. One expert, I think, aptly said that the increase that we saw in 2014 is not a blip, it's not going away soon, but nor is it a trend, and many of the long-term predictors of civil war are positive. The world is getting richer, the world is getting older, and those are two significant negative risk factors when it comes to civil war. We are not seeing much of a movement toward human rights in the Islamic world. On the other hand, I can't help but being something of an optimist. If you look at the advance of other human rights categories like slavery, it did take the Islamic world longer to catch up to the trend than what happened in the rest of the world. Saudi Arabia and Yemen only abolished slavery in 1962, and as I mentioned, Mauritania only in 1980. But abolish it, they did. There was a lag, but there is, I think, good reason to believe that, for example, the oppression of women and the use of cruel forms of punishment may go in the Islamic world the way slavery did. I don't think we are going to see an end to cheap, low-death, high-publicity violence, such as terrorism and rampage shootings, which actually cause very little damage compared to other forms of violence, but are a kind of journalist bait that are a guaranteed way to become famous with relatively little expenditure. That's going to continue to present an irresistible opportunity to people with a grievance worldwide. The biggest question of all is, why has violence declined on so many scales of time and magnitude? Is there some common dynamic that has caused all the violence reductions in the past, and which might be hoped to cause more violence reductions in the future? And I think there may be. Violence is what game theorists call a social dilemma. It's always tempting to an aggressor to exploit a victim, but of course the damage to the victim far outweighs the gain to the aggressor. Since over the course of history, victors can become aggressors and vice versa, we really all would be better off if all parties could agree to refrain from violence. The dilemma is, how do you get the other guy to refrain from violence at the same time as you do? Because if you beat your swords into plowshares, but the other guy keeps his swords as swords, then you could be in a world of pain. It's not unreasonable to think that over the course of history, human experience and human ingenuity have gradually chipped away at this problem, just like we have dealt with other scourges of the human condition, like pestilence and hunger. And the common denominator among all of the violence reduction measures that I've mentioned is that they all increase the material, emotional, or cognitive incentives of all parties to avoid violence simultaneously. In which case, violence reduction might be like other kinds of technological progress, perhaps an appropriate theme with which to end here at the 30th anniversary of the Media Lab. That is, like other kinds of technological progress, it is not linear, it is not inexorable, but it is highly likely over the long run. Congratulations, Media Lab. Thank you for having me back, and thanks to all of you for listening. Thank you.